Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation. Thank you for joining the session on public psychology and the right to science. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Public psychology is a new paradigm, aspiring to shift psychology to a truly publicly engaged science. Public psychology envisions the public as both originators and beneficiaries of research. It aims to be bi-directional in the way that the public benefits from psychology and the way that psychology benefits from the public. The speakers at this session will explain how the concept of public psychology is directly linked to the right to science and will provide concrete examples of its implications, including academic freedom, UN advocacy, and the defense of human rights. The session is structured in a way to provide you with some brief insights from experts in the field on several important and relevant topics. Those topics include public psychology and the right to science, freedom of expression in academia, psychology at the UN and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and finally, human rights defenders and psychological science. The session will conclude with an opportunity for questions from the audience and discussion among the panelists. Our panelists today include Asia Eaton. Dr. Eaton is a feminist social psychologist and associate professor of psychology at Florida International University. She is the director of the PhD track in applied social and cultural psychology and PI of the Power, Women, and Relationships Lab, which explores how gender intersects with identities such as race, sexual orientation, and class to affect individuals' access to and experience with power. In her quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods work, she engages social and cultural psychological theories and methods to address real-world social problems in collaboration with local, state, and national organizations and institutions. For example, since 2016, Dr. Eaton has served as head of research for a cyber civil rights initiative, which is working to understand and end the epidemic of image-based sexual abuse in the US. She was the lead guest editor of the recent special issue of American Psychologist on the topic of public psychology. Also speaking today is Laura Liguori. Laura is a PhD student in clinical psychology at Fielding Graduate University and is the executive director of MindBridge, a nonprofit organization dedicated to transforming human rights through the integration of neurobiological and psychological applied science. We also have Mia Smith Bynum. Dr. Bynum is the Senior Director of Science, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the American Psychological Association. She is also Professor of Family Science and Director of the Black Families Research Group in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is the author of The Theory of Racial Socialization in Action for Black Families and co-author of the Multidimensional Model of Racial Identity and the Multidimensional Inventory of Black Identity. She is the Deputy Director of Community Engagement for the Prevention Research Center at University of Maryland. Dr. Smith Bynum is the past chair of the Black Caucus of the Society for Research in Child Development. Her research has been supported by external grants from several entities, including the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. We will also hear from Dr. Gabriel Tews. Dr. Tews is the Senior International Affairs Officer at the American Psychological Association, where he works to advance psychology globally with a particular focus on human rights. He staffed APA's Task Force on Human Rights and is the association's main representative to the United Nations. Relevant publications include a chapter in the recent Cambridge Handbook of Psychology and Human Rights. Dr. Tews received his PhD in social psychology from Clark University. And finally, I am Dr. Kelly Haynes Mendez. I will be your moderator for the session. I am Senior Director of the Human Rights Team at the American Psychological Association. The APA Human Rights Team was established in 2020 with a particular concern to further APA's core value to respect and promote human rights, to focus on human rights, fairness, and dignity for all segments of society. Prior to joining the APA Human Rights Team, I was also Vice President for Diversity and International Relations at the Society for the Teaching of Psychology and Associate Professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology with 2 decades of experience teaching in graduate psychology programs. My scholarly work includes topics related to diversity, intersectionality, human rights, global citizenship, and multicultural issues. So I want to introduce the topic just by talking a little bit about the right to science and public psychology. The International Convention of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights makes it clear that all people enjoy the right to benefit from scientific progress and its applications. This encompasses the right to benefit from psychological science, as made clear by an American Psychological Association focus group in 2011, and it was reaffirmed by the APA Task Force on Human Rights in 2021. Ensuring equal access to the benefits of psychological science and practice is a fundamental connection between psychology and human rights. The APA Task Force on Human Rights, which was staffed by Dr. Tews, was comprised of several APA members and had the following charge: to develop a definition of human rights as related to psychology, to review APA's recent and ongoing human rights activities, to analyze comments and recommendations regarding human rights from APA boards and committees, to prioritize strategies, goals, and objectives for our engagement in human rights issues and activities, to create recommendations for organizational mechanisms that can ensure APA's ongoing and visible commitment to human rights, and to identify human rights-focused organizations and coalitions with which APA might work in the future. So the task force taking the lead of AAAS, developed the 5 connections framework between psychology and human rights. These connections are: psychologists possess human rights by virtue of being human, as well as specific rights essential to their profession and discipline. Psychologists apply their knowledge and methods to the greater realization of human rights. Psychologists respect human rights and oppose the misuse of psychological science, practice, and applications and their negative impact on human rights. Psychologists advance equal access to the benefits of psychological science and practice. And finally, psychologists advocate for human rights. So now we will hear from our panelists who will speak to very relevant issues between public psychology, human rights, and the right to science. First, we will hear from Dr. Asia Eaton, who will describe for us what is public psychology and how does it support the right to benefit from science.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Gabe, Mia, and Laura for putting this together. It's a critically timely topic, and I'm grateful to be here. Yes, my name is Asia Eaton, and I'm going to be talking about what public psychology is and how it supports the right to benefit from science. So there's a long history, actually, of APA calling for psychology to be used to benefit the public. In George Miller's 1969 APA address, he mentioned giving psychology away, giving the public access to psychological knowledge from which they can benefit. There's also 2018 APA President Jessica Henderson Daniels' initiative, Citizen Psychologist. In this initiative, which is ongoing, citizen psychologists are individuals who serve as leaders in their various communities through public engagement efforts. And this can include public service, volunteerism, board membership, etc. But public psychology goes beyond giving psychology away, as well as beyond citizen psychologist. It goes beyond giving psychology away because it's not just about the public benefiting from science. It's about the public motivating and shaping research, critiquing, co-designing, co-authoring. It's also less focused on the individual psychologist and their leadership than citizen psychology, and more focused on scientific practices and systems. Put simply, public psychology is psychology for and with the public. So it's not entirely a new idea, but to date, it really lacked a consistent definition. Has a lot in common with liberation psychology, some things in common with community psychology, open science, a lot in common with action research, citizen science. These terms are familiar to you. We've defined it as having 4 core principles. It's a framework that asks us to center social problems, engage diverse publics in knowledge creation, communicate and democratize psychological knowledge, and rethink what constitutes psychology. And I'm going to go through each of these with you. In terms of centering social problems, scientists have a fair amount of latitude in choosing what topics to investigate. Of course, all choices are constrained. We're bounded somewhat by funding and our own expertise. But we shouldn't be following just what interests us, or what we're trained in, or what's familiar to us, or what happens to be fundable, or what's relevant to our team, at least not until scientific teams are representative of the public, right? And they're not. We should be not thinking about what tools or scientific processes we have access to. We should be thinking about public interests and needs. And you may say, well, this is obvious. I would argue that although we write scientific papers as though they were motivated by public need, some of that can be afterthought. Even research that takes public issues into account as part of the original design doesn't necessarily take regular stock of the changing landscape of public life. We still need all the experts we currently have. We still need basic scientists. But even basic scientists can participate in public psychology through, for example, communication and democratization of psychological knowledge. I recognize and appreciate that we have lasers and GPS in the COVID vaccine because of basic science. But scientists need potentially to use different lenses, more interdisciplinary and more local lenses to do work that is translational and ends up serving the public. We also need to engage diverse publics in knowledge creation. What does this mean? Do the work with the public as co-creators. Who's on our team of experts? Who is considered as having the legitimacy to speak to these issues? And Dr. Smith-Bynum is going to speak to that when she gets up. What does it mean to be an expert? I'm an academic, and I don't know about if you're in academic departments or not, but I can tell you that more and more we're training students to be experts in scientific processes and skills, and less so in content. And so you have to ask yourself, who is the content expert? And I would argue that in a lot of cases, it's the public. And in psychology, we have a history of, for example, Cialdini's research on persuasion and conformity, asking people, how do you do things? How do you obtain persuasion in your career as a car salesman? And then using that and working backward to develop theories. We also have to think about if the items that we're assessing are consistent with public conceptualization of these issues. Are the terms we're even using culturally congruent and comprehensible? Are all the relevant stakeholders represented? Are the most vulnerable stakeholders centered? And are we courting and supporting the public in being our thinking partners? Communicating and democratizing psychological knowledge. Who has the right and ability to communicate science and to understand science. Obviously, this requires increased scientific literacy and access. Is science behind paywalls, or is it available to the public? If it is available to the public, is it written in ways that are inscrutable, right? Terminology that can't be digested by anyone, no matter how scientifically literate. I can tell you, when I read things just outside of my discipline, I can scarcely understand them half the time. We also have to think about walking through the entire scientific cycle as researchers and not jumping off early, not jumping off before the public communication and application components of our fields, right? Often we publish something in a journal and we split on to the next. And public psychology argues that we need to thread all the way through to the end of the process. And again, not everyone has to do this, and you don't have to do all elements of it. But I think that this is the way that we're going to make ourselves legible and trustworthy, and how we're going to have the greatest impact. And then last, rethinking what is psychology, and what does it mean to be an excellent psychologist, or to do excellent psychology? What is scientifically meritorious? And I heard a great quote from the philosopher Amartya Sen recently that said, "What's meritorious are actions that advance a valued consequence." The valued consequence could be shareholder value or university rankings. Public psychology argues that the valued consequence should be the common good, that actions that advance the common good are meritorious. And, APA has told us about what actions advance the common good already: reducing health disparities, the elimination of violence and poverty. So public psychology, and you can easily extend this to think about public science more broadly, has implications for a bunch of different individuals and groups. Firstly, for members of the public who deserve training to become our research partners, right? This is where public psychology intersects a little bit with slow science. Isabel Stengers talked about how we need a community of critical consumers of science. So it starts with scientific literacy, but we also need to have greater transparency and access to science in order to have a community of scientifically literate consumers and practitioners. This has implications for scientists, right? We need to actively invite and seek public input and participation in what we're doing. And I don't just mean advisory boards of community members on grants. I'm talking about PIs from the community who have ownership and power in the process. We have to reimagine our professional identities and how we train the next generation. They need to be trained to write for the public, how to build equitable and just partnerships with communities. This has implications for scientific institutions, in particular, rethinking what we prioritize and reward and how we motivate scientific endeavors. In academia, we have, the 3 pillars of academic work: research, teaching, and service. Where's public benefit in all of this? Is it maybe is supposed to be implicit in all of these? But I would argue that it needs to be positioned as a central process and product. This also has implications for how funding processes go. The public should be on grant review boards. Funding opportunities, some funding opportunities should be motivated by public need and opinion. This has implications for public institutions, right? In order for us to thread the needle all the way through, we need institutions and programming to be funded based on evidence, not based on politics. And we need ways to support coordination, collaboration, and partnership between public institutions and scientists and scientific institutions. Public policy. I just read, I don't know if it was a Gallup poll, but most of the public wants scientists to be involved in creating policy, right? And wants scientific evidence to be considered in developing policy and programming. Psychological scientists, other scientists should be involved in public policy as well as the public, determining what are the urgent policy needs, what are the ways to identify issues that need policy attention. And it has implications for the media, and this is in a couple of different ways. First is media communication about science. In the best of worlds, scientific writers and journalists are incredible partners in the dissemination of our knowledge. In the worst of worlds, the things that we produce as scientists are disseminated in biased, incomplete ways. And the only way to ensure that our research is communicated accurately and sufficiently simply for public consumption is for us to be involved in the process of media relations and communication. So we've got to be trained to do interviews and to write op-eds. We also need more scientists in the media talking about issues related to public well-being. What's going to stimulate the economy, for example, right? We have business owners and politicians giving us answers to these questions, and we need scientists at the table as well. We also need to change media images of how science is done and who scientists are. Psychological science is really well positioned to do this. We have a breadth of research showing that our images and stereotypes of scientists in the media are misleading, homogenous, and turn diverse individuals away from participating in the scientific process. So in the 2 minutes I have left, I'll take you through the public science life cycle with a partner of mine, CCRI, to give some concrete examples of how this can be done. So CCRI is Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and they came to me in 2015 or so, and they were trying to combat online bullying, abuse, and in particular, image-based sexual abuse or revenge porn, which you may have heard of. And they said, you know, we have our hotline and we have the evidence from our hotline. We have the people who come to us for legal aid, but we don't have systematic representative data to bring to policymakers to make our case that this is a form of sexual abuse and it should be illegal. And I partnered with them, and from the very beginning, they helped me to define the terms we were using and make sure they were expansive enough to include all victims. They wanted to be sure to have questions on criminalization and types of deterrence and things that were relevant for their work. You know, when it came to the sampling and the analysis, that was on me. Those are the skills I have, right? But they're the content experts. We published a white paper before the peer review paper was out because they wanted that data out right away. And we put it on their website, and we put Holly Jacobs, the CEO at the time, as one of the authors. Then when it came time to actually publishing the paper, you know, we worked very closely with them. They also put that on their website. Eventually, we worked together to use some of the findings from the paper to change state law around cyber sexual abuse to include dissemination by text messages, which we found was a very common way of disseminating this content, but it wasn't covered by the law. You know, we ended up doing press releases. We've put conferences on together. I've spoken to the media various times about this alongside CCRI, hand in hand. You know, we continue to work together in ways that are win-win-win that benefit both my university, the public, the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, the state of Florida. We're working on a national law right now called the SHIELD Act. I think it's been married to VAWA, which is still in process. But I've had to learn a lot as a result of this, and it's very humbling. Highly recommend public psychology approaches for teaching you scientific humility. But that's all I have.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Mia Smith-Bynum. Dr. Smith-Bynum will answer the question, why is freedom of expression in academia important to ensure actualization of the right to benefit from science?
Thank you so much. So when I got that, because that's a huge question first, let me just start there. And they said, answer it in what, 7 minutes, something like that? No problem. So what I elected to do is to try to frame this issue. So as you heard from my bio, I've done a lot of research on families of color. And one of my key areas, the technical term is racial socialization, but it's really how do Black parents prepare their kids to cope with racism? And it's an area of research that people think of as me-search. It's not really scholarly. She's just really studying herself. And so I'm going to talk about why that is so problematic. And so the title of my very short remarks are Higher Education, Academic Freedom, Science and Human Rights. Whose voices are legitimate and whose voices count? So we frame this in terms of a human rights construction. We're thinking about it in the context of who gets the wonderful privilege to pursue the scientific enterprise, which, as Dr. Eaton pointed out, you can kind of study whatever you want. And the problem I see it as that questions that apply a social justice lens, that those questions that look at societal problems, societal issues through the origins and the consequences of oppression, they're a threat to the status quo. And so what you can see right now in our public discourse, and the thing is, it's not just happening in higher ed, like it's happening through the book bans that we're seeing in K through 12 education and the staffing of school boards where people are being removed because they're trying to teach kids a comprehensive history, a comprehensive social sciences, and one that really critiques and evaluates all of our American story, the warts and all. And so what I've got here is just a couple of illustrations of key events where kids are really pushing back. We're seeing kids forming banned book clubs around the country because they recognize that censorship is like highly un-American, right? But yet, and the question is like, why now? Why are we seeing this spike in 2022? Other notable events, what we're seeing is happening in Florida. What a hotbed Florida is. My colleague is coming from Florida as well. That we're seeing faculty who want to assist with public psychology being told directly or indirectly behind the scenes that they cannot participate, they cannot apply their knowledge to solve or address these really consequential problems. And for myself, and I will call out my alma mater because I'm a UNC Chapel Hill alum, so I can kind of say it, is what we saw with the acclaimed journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, who after winning the Pulitzer and coming up with the 1619 Project, which is a work of journalism, is not a work of history, but yet people use the fact that she's using journalistic methods to attack the integrity of her work, which is really just white supremacy through an academic lens. And so we saw her denied tenure and these types of things. So this is what we mean by whose voices count, right? Whose voices are legitimate. Our country has changed. So when we think about what's happening in higher ed right now, For folks who are under age 20 or 19, the country is already a majority minority country, so to speak, right? What do I mean by that? By the time my son, who is now 18, is about 37, we will, as a country, have no single majority racial group. And it's happening right now, right? So we're talking 2044, roughly around in there. And so that's why we're seeing this upheaval, because we're seeing the elevation of these voices. We're seeing the science of diversity as far as LGBTQ plus populations and social media accelerating and advancing the visibility of these populations. We're seeing this also with the differently able community, that as these communities become more visible and are demanding to be a part of the space, now we're seeing all of this censorship. So we think about academic freedom. This is a definition that comes from the American Association of University Professors. Institutions of higher ed are conducted for the common good, the public good, and not to further the interests of either the individual teacher or the institution as a whole. The common good depends upon the free search for truth and its free exposition. And in 2022, censorship of scholarship elevating the voices of marginalized has spiked. And here, if we take an intersectional analysis, which if you've been following the news, critical race theory is an offshoot of critical race theory, is also being attacked. And when we think about this, all of this has to do with who has access to power, right? And so when we think about the scientific enterprise, we got a pretty little representative panel up here. Like we're doing pretty good. Thank you, APA colleagues, for putting this together. But we know that pick a subfield, pick chemistry, psychology, physics, engineering. When you look at the composition of those professions, they do not represent the US population as a whole. And so as these voices, as those folks that I pointed to on that previous slide illustrates, that we see people banning books as we see these ascendant populations, voices that have been marginalized, grabbing the wheels of power. And so we see this with voting rights. I mean, I could go on and I could be up here all day, but I'm going to stop. The access to power often determines the shape and the content of scientific knowledge, right? So we think about which grants get funded, who's in the room. And as my colleague was talking, I was thinking, how would the public feel about the science that we're funding when it comes to human behavior? Would they be happy with us? And I think in some cases, yes, but in some cases, no. So I'm going to move on and close and talk about the diversification of the academy, because this is essential. And so what I'm saying here is not research, is not it is not my personal opinion. This is based on research. Scholars of different backgrounds bring fresh perspectives to research questions and societal problems. We want, as a nation, the best, most creative minds working on big issues, including those that involve human rights. All of society and humanity benefit from these discoveries. Failure to honor it reinforces inequities and differential access to quality of life. Thank you so much.
Now you can see why we invited Dr. Smith Bynum to be a part of our panel. Thank you so much for that dynamic presentation. Next, we will hear from Dr. Gabe Tooze. Dr. Tooze will explore the question, how can psychology be applied at the United Nations to advance the Sustainable Development Goals?
I cannot believe I have to go after that. Wow. Thank you so much to my co-panelists and everyone listening in the room and virtually. So appreciate all of you. As Kelly said, I work at the APA Central Office, and one of my roles there is to serve as the association's main representative to the UN. So I'm going to speak for just about 10 minutes today about advocacy at the UN, how that links with human rights, the focus of this coalition, and to an extent, public psychology, which I have just so enjoyed learning about. This will necessarily be quite rushed, so I apologize in advance, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with some of you afterwards. Our vision of our work at the UN concretely incorporates human rights. Human rights is central to so much of what we do, and I'm going to give a number of examples of that as we go through this presentation. But I wanted to get that clear from the outset. Whereas public psychology aims to center social problems, engage diverse publics, and communicate and democratize psychology. And I think we do that to an extent, and there are ways that we could do it more, and maybe we can come back to that. Some people may be asking, what is a professional association doing at the UN? And that's absolutely a fair question. But it turns out in the UN Charter, the document that established the UN, it lays out a process by which the UN system is supposed to engage with civil society organizations. So we're not pushing ourselves. Well, sometimes we're a bit pushy, but generally speaking, they are supposed to engage with us. This is something that they are supposed to be doing. And we really try to take advantage of that through affiliation with two separate UN bodies. The first is Economic and Social Council, with which we've been affiliated since 1999. And the second is the Department of Global Communications, formerly called Department of Public Information. And each of those affiliations entails different rights and responsibilities, which probably go beyond the scope of this presentation. But if anyone is interested in learning more about getting your association involved with either of these, please do come speak with me. This is our team on the ground in New York. They do wonderful work, and I'm pleased for the opportunity to recognize them in a forum like this. Irina is our main representative, and then we have Michelle, Roseanne, Ayoka, Nelida, Comfort, and Rashmi. Roseanne, if anyone saw the panel before this, was part of that one. She did a terrific job talking about human rights education. Sustainable Development Goals. Many of you probably know already, but in case anyone is not familiar, this is a group of 16 interlinked goals. So you can't do one without the other. These big, ambitious goals: peace building, ending poverty, combating climate change, ensuring gender equality, that the countries of the world agreed that they would try to accomplish by 2030. Are they going to do all of them? No, but it does set out an ambitious framework for countries to work toward and attempt to measure their progress toward. And that's an important part. Can you measure what you're actually doing? Lots of what we do is going to meet with member states and UN agencies and trying to say, here's how psychology is relevant to trying to accomplish progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. Often what we first hear is, isn't that for crazy people? Or are you reading my mind right now? So there's a huge educational piece involved. Psychology is it's the study of the mind, human behavior. And since the SDGs are fundamentally about improving the human condition, psychology is relevant to almost all of them in one way or another. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to go through, I forget, maybe 5 or so of the SDGs and explain work we have done to try and further their progress. The first one is SDG 3, which is good health and well-being. And I would be remiss here if I didn't mention that it was psychological advocacy at the UN leading up to the 2015 establishment of the Sustainable Development Agenda that ensured that mental health was included in this SDG. I was not part of this, all it was way before my involvement, but they did just a fantastic job working with member states, particularly Palau, ensuring that the countries of the world committed to promoting mental health. So now we do a number of things to try and do that. We worked with the World Health Organization last year to do a literature review, essentially, underlying a policy brief they did on youth risk behaviors in the context of COVID. Due to that partnership, our science went out to a couple 100 million people, which is far more than we ever could have done alone. So this really magnified the impact we could have, the people we could reach. We sponsor a global mental health fellowship every year in which a psychologist is placed with a particular office on mental health at World Health Organization, ensuring that psychological science contributes to the promotion of good health and well-being in that sense. We sponsored an event, this was last year, the one I'm going to talk about now, on good health and well-being, on health equality, primarily sponsored by Costa Rica, but also there were another 15 UN member states who signed on to this. So we had UN ambassadors from all of these countries talking about the importance of health equity and mental health equity in making progress toward the SDGs. We had the Vice President of Costa Rica. We had psychological scientists talking about what specifically they could contribute. This was a real contribution. And we submit lots of comments. Kelly recently did just a fantastic job coordinating APA comments to the World Health Organization, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, on mental health, human rights, and legislation. So we're hopeful that our input there will contribute to the development of this document. SDG 10 focuses on reduced inequalities. Thank you. One of the pitfalls you can sometimes encounter working as an American association at the UN, you don't want to come off as this colonial power telling countries what to do. That just backfires spectacularly. And so one of the ways we've tried to combat this is by partnering with our colleagues in the Global Psychology Alliance, which is this group of about 70 countries that have come together to form this association of national and international psychology associations. So we have brought presidents of national psychology associations into meetings with their UN ambassadors and their UN missions to speak about issues relevant to their country. So for this particular initiative, we partnered with associations in Jamaica and Ghana and brought them into meetings with their ambassadors to speak about the importance of racial and ethnic health equality, particularly the importance of data collection to make sure that no groups are being left behind. And because we were able to bring these local groups into these meetings, we were able to have far more effective meetings, and we do hope to continue this model moving forward. SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. This wasn't one that I would ever think would psychology have particularly relevance for, but we were asked to speak at a high-level meeting, which means ministers from around the world flew to New York and spoke at this meeting. We had the opportunity, due to a relationship we formed with the Office of the President of the General Assembly, who invited us to explain to the UN community why psychology is relevant to urbanization, particularly in the context of climate change. Our leader at Irina Fagina did a wonderful job on this, and let's hope this works. Jonathan, would you be able to show the video?
Organizational behavior and group dynamics. It is rooted in research and committed to improving human well-being. The American Psychological Association is the leading scientific and professional organization representing psychology in the US, with more than 130 members and affiliates, including more than 16,000 psychologists from 182 countries outside the US. The Global Psychology Alliance regularly convenes over 70 psychology associations from every continent. WHO data shows that globally, anxiety and depression increased by 25% during the pandemic. Concurrently, climate impacts are causing increasing disruption and stress in communities and eco-anxiety about the future. Urban life exacerbates these impacts with its own challenges. These include the silent epidemic of isolation and loneliness, especially if cities are not mindfully designed to increase interaction and community, as well as intergroup conflicts brought about by population density, poverty, and competition for resources. Psychological science offers solutions that improve urban well-being and address these challenges. These include providing culturally competent mental health services, creating green spaces which reduce stress and anxiety, and public spaces that support.
So this was just a wonderful opportunity to speak on the UN floor in a way that's very, very rare for civil society. It's like a civilian speaking on the floor of Congress. It just doesn't happen very often. So Irina did a nice job there. And I think this is the last one I'm going to talk about. I know I'm over time. I'm sorry. SDG 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions. We did a lot of advocacy last year following the upheaval in Afghanistan, supporting the evacuation of a number of Afghan mental health professionals who were facing death threats due to their collaboration with Western institutions like the World Bank, like USAID. We worked with a number of civil society organizations to disseminate a letter to the Group of Friends of Mental Health, which is the equivalent of a congressional caucus, countries who say they care about mental health. And due in part to this advocacy, I think almost all of our colleagues in Afghanistan were evacuated and found placements in the US or Europe. So finally, I guess my main takeaway is here. There's a role for science at the UN. If you would like to learn more about doing this through your association, please come talk to me. I think it's an underutilized role. And there's more we can do to bring in a public psychology framework, I think, which to this point is fairly underdeveloped. And I'm looking forward to learning more about how to do that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tooze. I'm so excited about the work that you do at the UN. Thank you so much for being the face of psychology to the world. Yeah. So I'd like to welcome our last panelist, Laura Liguori. Laura will explore with us how can international human rights defenders make use of psychological science in practice, as well as what are the challenges of a public psychology approach in human rights settings.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's quite the honor to be here with all of these incredible speakers that I have to go after all of them, which is really something. So I am a clinical doctoral student, and I'm also the executive director of MindBridge. MindBridge is a nonprofit organization that uses psychology and neuroscience to support human rights. And this work was really inspired when I was at MIT at the Sachs Lab for Social Cognitive Neuroscience, where I got to work with Rebecca Sachs and Emile Bruno, where we were studying the role of the brain. So in addition to our structures, our policies, our institutions, and our practices, what is it fundamentally about our brain as biological human beings that substantially contributes to the propulsion of violence between groups? So anywhere you go in the world and at different historical moments in time, what is it about us as neurobiological beings that continues this process? And what was really interesting is that we wanted this research fundamentally to be applied. It wasn't research for research's sake, but we wanted to be able to do research to build better, more effective interventions that worked with governments and human rights defenders around the globe. And what was tremendous about this work, unfortunately at that time, many researchers wanted their work to be applied. They really sought to use their research for the public good. But at the time when I was at MIT, there were cuts in NIH and NSF funding, which largely made this impossible. Simultaneously, human rights defenders wanted to gain access to this work, but didn't quite know how. So how to use this work, how to best translate it, how to integrate it, and so on. For many human rights defenders that I would work with, they would talk to me about, Laura, we seek to change hearts and minds. We want to transform hearts and minds around the globe. But then when I asked them, how are you doing that? I largely got a question mark. Right? In 2016, Qazi Rasool Hoque, the then chairman of the National Human Rights Commission in Bangladesh, cited 2016 as the worst year in human rights abuses since World War II. For those of us who read Human Rights Watch annual report, how many of us read this every year? All right, a couple of friends in the audience. For the rest of you, you have your homework. So Human Rights Watch annual report defines human rights abuses around the world, as well as some of the success stories. But what you'll see is this constant evolution of human rights abuses that feels never ending. What are we going to do as human rights defenders to really stop violence in all of its forms around the world? Is there something that we can do? So this question mark would just continuously grow. And as human rights defenders sought to find new answers to sustained problems, they started to turn to psychology. For them, this was possibly the new direction to take. For many human rights defenders, they are lawyers or activists. So for many of them, they work within the realm of structures, institutions, policy, and politics. And for them, entering into the realm of psychology and neuroscience was new. These were topics related to our emotions, our values, our beliefs, our biases, and so on, right? Everything that goes into what makes us human. And the grand irony for many human rights defenders is that we had in fact lost the humanity in our work. So how could we understand our psychology? How could we understand our neurobiology as not just sidelines to human rights efforts, but an integral component to furthering human rights around the world? How could we do this? For public psychology within the human rights domain, right, as my colleagues have already described, there's many aspects to this work and ways in which we integrate, right? Psychological presence, whether that is the presence of the research, the findings, the data, or the psychologists, therapists themselves, right? How are we actually entering into this applied domain? Do we talk to people? Are we going into the communities, or are we staying within our labs or our therapy offices? How are we translating this work? It's often not enough just to hand someone a piece of paper, but the active translation of the work is important. How are we integrating that work more than being present and now translating? Are we actively integrating this into interventions, policies, and practice that directly come into relationship with the communities? And finally, how are we taking that and strengthening our research even more so, right? Ultimately, what this all means is that this is a bidirectional partnership. It is a partnership of which Asia spoke to so eloquently before. We are intimately partnered with our community, with the human rights defenders who put themselves out on the line every day. So since I'm here at the AAAS, I wanted to talk about some examples in the US. This comes from my work within MindBridge. When we talk about human rights and human rights defenders, we can talk about a lot of things. We can talk about human rights of healthcare, housing, education, food insecurity. I'm going to talk about domestic terrorism and racial trauma and mental health of human rights defenders. For domestic terrorism, the Biden administration about a year ago put out a statement about how the Biden administration was going to go about mitigating and intervening on growing domestic terrorism and extremist ideology within the United States. Psychology was not mentioned. But we know absolutely that psychology and psychologists will in fact be involved. Unless we repeat issues from Guantanamo and other locations, it is really important that we go into this with our eyes wide open. But human rights defenders are starting to move on this on their own. Sophie Kandor at the International Center for Counterterrorism at The Hague wrote this extraordinary statement taking a look at the underlying cognitive mechanisms contributing to domestic terrorism and extremist ideology. Her work dips into psychology and takes almost a clinical perspective into the cognitive schema, the values, beliefs, and orientations of those who are drawn into these spheres. Separately, my friends at Moonshot is an AI organization. This organization sought to intervene on growing domestic terrorism within the United States by approaching social media and online activism. So their project is incredibly complex. I won't go into details, but in a nutshell, they wanted to be able to identify individuals at risk or vulnerable to taking on extremist ideology and or becoming involved in violence. So through AI magic, and there's lots of AI conversations happening at the conference throughout these couple of days, through AI magic, they want to be able to identify these individuals that had those kind of characteristics that might be recruited through various domestic terrorism organizations and to intervene. Their intervention was to be able to siphon them off to a therapist. So by linking to local area therapists, they want to be able to gain them some psychological support in order to transform the cognitive mechanisms and schema that were contributing to their vulnerabilities. Now, questions, of course, are raised as to who are the therapists and are they adequately trained? Right? What is the ethics around this? How can we do this? Are we tracking this? What are the effects? Do we know what the effects are beyond other questions? So human rights defenders are starting to take up this work themselves. They see, and are increasingly so, seeing the need to understand the human from the values, beliefs, cognitive schema, these underlying mental psychological components, but are often guessing and are applying and experimenting without the involvement of psychologists or therapists directly. Human rights defenders. How many of you identify as a human rights defender? Absolutely everyone in this audience should be raising their hand, by the way. Okay. I see you smiling, but human rights defenders, right? So many of us are putting ourselves on the line, right? We advocate for justice, right? For real responsibility, for advocacy. We're going to hold and sustain this work for the communities that are in harm's way. Human rights defenders are also subject to extraordinary stress, vicarious, if not direct forms of trauma. Studies by the New School, NYU, and Columbia University have looked at the ways in which human rights defenders in particular have heightened rates of anxiety, depression, and symptoms related to PTSD. However, the mental health of human rights defenders, and human rights defenders are thousands of them, is often ignored. In 2018, thank you. In 2018, the subject got a glimmer of some awareness when 2 human rights defenders in Amnesty International committed suicide. At that point, there was a spark of acknowledgement of the mental health of human rights defenders, and as quickly as it came, it went. Particularly within the United States, when we're talking about the rise of BLM and racial justice movements, there are compounded effects. Individuals who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, who might themselves experience racial harm and oppression and or trauma, who also identify as human rights defenders, are even more at risk. At a recent conference at the New England Law University at Boston, I moderated a panel on this intersection of mental health, human rights defenders, particularly within the racial justice field. And for the 3 other speakers that were there, their experience of mental health within the racial justice sphere varied dramatically, from we never looked at it until too much harm had happened, to we are integrating mental health within our truth, racial justice, and reconciliation processes within individual towns, to we're just starting on this path. Ayasha Bankhead was one of the panelists here, and she noted something really important in particular. She said, it is important that we do this, practices of wellness and healing, in connection with others, that we are seen. And this really speaks to that partnered approach where we bring about health and wellness. We integrate psychology within human rights in a way that is truly partnered, that is seen and present with and within communities. For all of this, we're starting to feel that there's a movement, but maybe still a bit of disconnection for psychologists and therapists who want to get involved within the human rights sphere. For MindBridge, we took inspiration from the recent APA journal that was talking about, that was focused on public psychology, in particular, the article by Miles and Fassinger, talking about scientist, practitioner, advocate training model. At MindBridge, we are currently starting to build such a model where we offer training to psychologists in how to best partner with human rights defenders within the United States. For us, this is a necessary next step. We want to be able to move beyond talking about psychology, neuroscience within human rights and human rights defenders to how can we best train psychologists to be actively engaged, to work with, to partner with, and become immersed in the communities they seek to support. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to each of our panelists. That was absolutely wonderful and stunning, and so much wonderful information was shared. We have about 14 minutes for questions from the audience. I know that we have some folks in the Zoom that Jonathan was going to read questions from, and then if we have folks here in the auditorium who would like to ask questions, we just ask that you use the microphones. Yes.
Hi, I would request that we even go over the 14 minutes and cut into the break if necessary. Anyway, that's just for your consideration. Okay, my name is Mindy Reiser. Among other things I do, I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services, and I've been affiliated with AAAS in various ways. This is a question to all of you, but I think I'll start with Dr. Eaton. Of course, we want conversations. We want them among people from the widest range of worlds. And there's a challenge in the very words we use, okay? I don't need to emphasize the concern with implicit bias and microaggressions. And then we get into a world where people may be afraid to say anything, coming from worlds where certain conversations go on, where words are used without very much thought. So how can we encourage honest dialogue? For example, folks may be going to, as we heard this morning, to work with people in criminal justice settings at Marquette University. That's fabulous. And some of the language used there may trigger all kinds of reactions. So the general question is how to be involved in ongoing dialogue and cognizant of implicit abuse and humiliation and shame, but yet allow a dialogue to continue.
Thank you so much. If I understood your question correctly, one way to address this is to ask communities about the terms that they use, are comfortable with, identify as. So we, in psychology, we pre-test our study materials in our samples. We pre-test to make sure this persuasive message is actually persuasive. We pre-test to make sure that these faces are equally attractive. Why don't we pre-test the terms that we use to refer to communities and allow them to choose their own terms? And this way we won't be, going with our own zeitgeist about what we think is popular or just, but we'll be allowing communities to define themselves in their terms. The other issue is that there is a rash of laws, especially in Florida, prohibiting academics from speaking freely about certain topics. And, we have to, for example, critical race theory, which Mia talked about. There's restrictions, for example, on women's reproductive health, and now we can't even really talk about it. So this is a really dangerous cycle. We have to make sure that we work with our local and state lawmakers to combat laws and policies that infringe on our intellectual freedom. So those are two suggestions I have that speak to the issue you raised.
Yeah, can I pop in for a second? Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, everything that was just said, I'll just plus one on that for a second. And also I'd say that for our work, we do a lot of work in implicit bias and anti-racist practice within communities. And for us, a fundamental component has been trust. So in addition to the 30,000-foot view and social media and so forth and so on, how are we engaged with communities directly, and how are we building trust with them so that we can start to deconstruct these biases and schemas that are contributing to discriminatory and violent practices? And that comes when people allow themselves to be vulnerable, and that takes time.
Thank you. I think we had another question here
Yes.
in the auditorium.
Dorothy Phillips from American Chemical Society. I was listening, and we say science in my world is physical science, and yours is the psychology of social science. But do we need to be together more in terms of especially reaching out to the community? And should we have courses in the academy that we as physical scientists spend a little time in your world so that we can better communicate and connect? I have a second question, but that one I have first.
I wonder if Dr. Smith-Bynum can speak to that.
That's a good question. I was just on a panel with another major umbrella organization for the physical sciences, and this issue came up because sometimes what people try to do is to push back on things that have a strong human rights or social just angles, they'll say, well, let's focus on the science, like why are we talking this diversity stuff, And so, but the practices are the science. It's behavioral science, right? But because the undergraduate curricula that draw people into our respective professions don't really integrate those worlds very well, I think a lot of places they'll call it the general education curriculum. That's the first 2 years of undergrad, and a lot of places where you get an array of courses primarily in what are thought of as the liberal arts. And then as you advance, you get into the junior and senior year, and you're largely in your major. But I think one of the things that I've seen at the University of Maryland is a course called the I course. And you can almost sort of think of the I as innovation, and they draw faculty into these fellowships where you're supposed to think outside the box and to put together a curriculum that can speak to the big issues of the day. Because what I as a psychologist and a behavioral scientist, what I would tell my students who were largely engineers and pre-med, I would say, when you come up with this great invention and you set it down in the middle of humanity with all of its complexity, you can do some great things or some very destructive things, or a combination of the two. So this piece around us respecting the contributions of each world, I think, is really important. And I think a lot of that starts with the folks who teach the hard sciences, is that if they don't respect what we bring to the table as far as understanding human behavior, it's going to be very hard. And I think we have a lot to offer. And the problems today, they really require more than one discipline at the table. Like, I think climate change is a very good example of it, is that you can understand the physics and the biology and the science and the chemistry of that on so many different levels, but how do you get human behavior? How do you get societies and governments to change their focus on kind of current economic interests to think about the long-term consequences? That's the integration of the two. So I would say you got to really rethink the way we do undergraduate education to have people appreciate it from a full three-dimensional point of view.
Thank you for that answer, but I'll just add, I think it has to continue into the graduate level education, getting those courses in the early years, and then we get synced into our science. I'll say that for myself. You put that to the side and you focus on the physical things. But I think it's also the whole area of diversity, equity, inclusion, and et cetera, and bringing that back to say in the physical sciences, we got to have that type, address that too, means you can't stop at the undergraduate. I think you got to move beyond the undergraduate to the graduate courses. Okay, so I will stop, because there's another election. But I'll just add, I wanted to ask on the UN question, because we at the American Chemical have a big focus on the sustainability goals of the UN. And you have a focus. So I'm looking at, again, this is a place where there can be cross interaction in terms of the sustainability goals. So probably we need more conversation.
Yeah, let's talk more after. Absolutely. Thank you.
We have another question in the auditorium.
Actually, comment, I think I could expand a little bit on your answer to the last question, which I think is extremely important. Something that I came across recently through the National Academy of Sciences. They are reaching out more and more to various community and civil organization groups, and involving more of the citizenry and the local governance is very helpful in coordinating with science. And I'll give you my prime example of it, but it's only one of many, many, many. And that is, there is an organization called Climate Mayors. I don't know if you've heard of it, but that's mayors of major cities, or hundreds of them across the United States, who are concerned with all of the things involved in keeping the urban infrastructure up to date, and that includes considerations of housing, accessibility to various services by disadvantaged people, and all of those things. They have a universal human rights perspective on solving these problems, which automatically merge human rights and science. So I would just urge all of your students and your faculty, for that matter, to become aware of organizations of that type that actually can get something done, and they're reaching out for influence from experts.
Thank you very much. So I think we have time for one more.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Thanks for the panel. Really interesting work. I'm wondering a little bit about this question that was posed throughout on public psychology and its interaction with advocacy, and how you are positioning your association in terms of responding to some of the sort of full frontal attacks that there are on some of the good things that psychology has done in terms of both looking at social emotional learning, for example, for children in the child development field, for understanding trauma and racial inequality, this sort of consistent attack on these things. How much does your association and this public psychology movement actually engage in trying to counteract these
Right.
attacks? Thank you.
So I can speak to that just a little, and then I think Asia and Gabe may have more insight, but the APA Advocacy Office does quite a bit of advocacy around social justice issues, but primarily within the US. So I work with the human rights team, and our portfolio on women mobilized very quickly to respond to the overturning of the Roe decision, for instance. So we gathered many psychologists together. We had an advocacy briefing of the landscape around this particular topic, and invited psychologists into the room to do a listening session around how psychologists who are working in their states and in their local communities can also advocate on behalf of the women they serve. We've also seen a lot of advocacy, particularly around state level anti-trans legislation issues that are occurring, and also being led by our sexual orientation and gender diversity portfolio. Primarily the advocacy activities that we are engaged in are sort of at the sort of federal executive level, and then also mobilizing psychologists who want to apply that science and to bring together psych science and advocacy to make progress and advocate for human rights in their local communities. But I wonder if Gabe, do you or Asia have additional comments?
Sure. So first, I would strongly recommend, if you haven't already, checking out Kevin Nadal's work on becoming a psychologist activist. He's written extensively on this. And I'll just say that for myself, we're in a post-positivist scientific landscape. And personally, I front load my philosophy and approach to science. All scientific theories and endeavors are built on some broader ideology and philosophy. And I'm just more explicit about what mine is. I just talk about being a public psychologist, a feminist psychologist, right? Meaning that my work is intended to center and support marginalized women and girls. A lot of scientists just have unexamined philosophies that they operate from. I'm explicit. I use reproductive justice lens, right? I'm an intersectional feminist. And I would encourage other scientists to closely examine the fundamental assumptions underlying the work that they do, and to become more explicit with those.
From the international perspective, I wouldn't say we respond to attacks on psychology as such, although they certainly exist, of course. I think we engage in the same kinds of issues. For example, racism against people of African descent in UN speak. We've done lots of work on that, partnering with our friends at the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. I think I gave one example of it in one of my slides, trying to ensure that when countries are presenting data on their progress toward the SDGs, they break down that data by the correct kinds of categories to ensure that no one's being left behind. There's another group at APA called ISINET, and I'm going to forget what that stands for now, Carrie, but they combat discrimination against LGBT plus people internationally, and they are just a fantastic group doing really wonderful education and advocacy work. So I would say as a whole, APA is fairly active on these kinds of issues.
I would add one other thing, just because it's relatively new, and I'm not sure how much this audience may know about it, is the APA Racism Apology. And so if you Google American Psychological Association Racism Apology, it is a set of documents, one in which the association accounts for its role in promoting American racism within our field, and with it and not standing up for race-related injustices in our society. And there's a whole history of that on our website. And coming out of that are a set of over 50 resolutions, which the association is holding itself accountable for the role. And I think I had just gotten to APA about a month, 3 weeks after starting, like this big thing happens. And I was like, wow, my timing's great. What I really love about that effort is the accountability within the association itself, and modeling that for other professional associations, which takes a lot of courage. These are painful lessons, but it's very important, I think, in terms of walking the walk. And so it's not just the front-facing work that my colleagues have just described, but there's internal work that's happening and a number of projects that still are about 6 months to a year that we're working on. Asia is working on one of those internal efforts with me that are remedies or responses to those resolutions as well, that I think have great relevance to human rights.
Thank you. Laura, do you have any final comments as we wrap up about anything that you've heard today?
No, I can't speak to the APA, right? But I will put in my 2 cents about that scientist advocacy practitioner training model again, that, there's so much more that we can do, right? That, so many psychologists don't know how to be an advocate, don't know the policy-based methods, don't know how to engage with human rights defenders or organizations, don't know how to become active in that domain or the ethics around it. And so I think the more support we can give to psychologists and therapists in this realm, I think the better.
Thank you. I think that brings us to a close. Thank you so much for your time. I know that many of us will be here available to you after this session. So if you'd like to come up and give us an introduction, and we can exchange contact information with you, and we'll be happy to support your efforts in these areas. Thank you so much.